Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak.
What if race isn't in our DNA, but something that we've been taught to see through the lens of science? Not just a social label, not just a political construct, but a scientific story that's been written and rewritten to fit the times. Today, we're joined by Rina Bliss, sociologist and author of What's Really Real About Race, to dismantle one of the most deeply entrenched myths in modern science, that race is written in our DNA.
Rina unpacks how science has been used and often misused to define race, and why these narratives continue to shape everything from medicine to education and even criminal justice. We're diving into the twisted history of how race became biological, why that idea refuses to die, and what it really means when scientists claim to find racial differences. So, what is race, really, if the genome can't define it?
Hi, Rina. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your background to our listeners?
Definitely. So I'm Dr. Rina Bliss. I'm a genetics expert. I'm a sociologist. I am a professor at Rutgers University. And I teach classes on everything from health and illness, mental health. That's one of the focuses of my research and also my teaching. And I also do a lot of research into new genetic sciences. I try to look at whatever is emerging from the field of genetics, which is now focused on genomes, so we call it genomics. And I try to, not only explain what different researchers are finding in that field, but also try to interpret what it means for us as regular, everyday people, what their emerging knowledge means for ourselves personally, what it means for ourselves socially and, politically. Also, how that knowledge is going to affect the different kind of institutions and organizations and just environments that we move through in our days. So that's kind of the focus of my work. I'm also a mom. I have 3 small kids, and I try to think about what the implications are for future generations, not just the immediate present moment for us, but also, how things are going to unfurl with all of this new knowledge that we have about ourselves.
And so you wrote a book, What's Real About Race? Untangling Science, Genetics, and Society. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
It's actually my 4th book on kind of the relationship between race and genetics. And as I was saying before, our genomes, right? Like we're learning so much about how we operate, what our bodies do, how our cells program some of our growth and into some extent shape or inform our behavior. But one of the things that we have been learning from the most kind of recent forms of genomic science are how important our environments are to our cells and what our genes actually do. And so when I started out writing books on this topic, I was really just looking at what the Human Genome Project and other really big global initiatives were saying about race and genomics. And at the time, in the beginning, scientists were just saying, well, there's not really anything in there that speaks of race in our genes, right? So like if we look at a genome or we compare different genomes across the world, what we find is that you can't tell somebody's race just by looking at their genes. And so that was kind of a surprising finding, but also kind of not a surprising finding for people who had been studying race and biology for a long time, because those folks from pretty much most of the second half of the 20th century were saying like, you know what, race is a social construct. It's something that we create together from the experiences that we share of racism, racial discrimination, and bias. So that was kind of like the new message that we got from the Human Genome Project. There's no such thing as race on a genetic basis. Yes, on a social basis, political basis, no on a genetic basis. But soon after, there was a new evolution of genomic science, so to speak, where scholars started to look at human behaviors and tried to kind of figure out what genes were associated with those behaviors. in this kind of interim term around like the early 2000s to the 2000 teens, we saw a lot of scientists kind of going back a little bit on that initial message and saying, well, there are differences, but we just don't really know how the social thing we call race relates to the biological stuff that we're studying here in our DNA labs. So also there was this, huge emergence of market and ancestry tests. So, people were kind of like, well, you're telling me, you companies are telling me that I hail from this continent or that continent. So, and, some of the companies in the beginning, the tests would say like whether you were 50% white or 30% Native American or whatnot. And so, there was a lot of race talk in the field of genomics, even if those early scientists were like, no, there's no such thing. So, I was looking at that emergence of this new behavior science, and I wrote a book about that. That was published in 2018. So, it was kind of like not that long ago, but still long enough ago that things changed a lot since then. And when I looked at, so like that, I'll say the first book that I wrote was called Race Decoded. The second book was called Social by Nature because it was looking at social behavior. And then in 2023, I kind of pulled together all of this even more fascinating, I feel like it just keeps getting more and more crazy and interesting, science on gene editing, CRISPR, and the kind of thing where we can go into our genomes and cut and paste, like change things and see what happens when we change certain genes and things like that. So I wrote a book called Rethinking Intelligence that was on kind of this new development of CRISPR science and also looking at this huge, as I was just saying, like this like wave of science looking at the way the environment actually shapes our behavior. So there's kind of almost like it's not really contradictory, but if you are just a layperson looking at it and then looking at the news, it might seem contradictory. It feels like we've got some scientists who say you can just, chop and screw our DNA. And then if you do that, you can like program different kinds of behaviors. So that sounds very like DNA just determines our behavior, And then we had these other scientists who were saying like the environment shapes our DNA. The environment actually tells our DNA whether to turn on or off. So, it's almost like if you're in a place where you have healthy food and you have a lot of safe and great places to exercise, you got clean air, all of that kind of stuff, you'll have your DNA working better for you. Your body will do the right thing, what it's supposed to do to keep you healthy and growing. If you have the opposite kind of experience, you've got adverse exposures, you're breathing toxic air, you're eating toxic food, you're working in toxic environments, not getting enough sleep, all of this kind of stuff, like your bodies will basically not work for you, not do their best. So we had this like kind of other message that was saying it was really like the environments that were shaping us. So I was like, okay, gotta write about that now. And then when I came to this point of having that book out and like seeing what did I want to talk about now, I realized, I think people still are wondering after all these different messages, some of them seeming contradictory to one another, what is real though about race. And I often would be, giving a talk or being, at a bookstore and signing books and having people come up to me saying, but I see race. So why are you telling me that it's not real? Like I see what you look like and I see what this other person looks like and I see what I look like in the mirror. So how can you tell me that it's not real? So I thought, I'm just going to write this book, What is Real About Race? And explain those things.
When did you realize like, okay, this has to be a book?
I was approached by the press who published this book, which is Norton Press, W.W. Norton and Company. And so I was approached and asked if I wanted to write on this topic. But I had been thinking, there's a need for it. So it was this really great synergy between the press and myself, just feeling like this is the time we need to write this book. And so I also, my first two books were academic books. And so with academic books, not a lot of people outside of academia or scholarly circles really see those books. And my book, Rethinking Intelligence, and then this book, What's Real About Race, they've been books written for the general public. So I felt like this urge to write something that could sum up a lot of the research that I've already done, but also give all kinds of, my hot takes on all the new science that's been emerging in just, even the last year. There have been really big changes, even since I published my last book for the general public. So I knew I wanted to reach as many people as possible with this message, because it's still that thing of like, even when you say like, this is what DNA scientists have found, and this is really like the conclusion that we can draw about our genomes, that there is no such thing as race, genetically, biologically speaking, people are still in disbelief, right? Because if you see it, you believe it.
What is race in terms of how people generally define it? Is it real? And what is your interpretation of race versus ethnicity versus, like, if you take the ancestry test, what are you really looking at?
The first thing I want to say is that race is a social reality. It's born of the politics of our communities, of our nation, our world, really. Like there's a kind of racial politics that we see playing out specific to the USA, but we also see, parallels in other countries. And there is a way in which there's a kind of general sense of what race means, and it's not like the scholarly thing that I was talking about before, what DNA scientists say, but it's more like a lay definition, a folk definition that has been pretty much a global definition since the first so-called scientists or philosophers or naturalists or whatnot started talking about race. The first thing I want to say is it's a social reality, not a biological reality, although there are biological effects. I'll go into that in a minute. So race is what we experience from discrimination, from bias. Racial discrimination and bias creates the racism that impacts our lives and makes us feel and have our lives structured in ways that create these kind of dichotomies of experience. Now, that's a little bit of like an abstract way of just saying that the lie that we were sold all that time ago, back in the Enlightenment period, I'm talking like, 17th, 18th century kind of times, before modern science, like that lie has created the biases and structural realities that have us experience race. That's the reality of race.
Could you just briefly say what that lie was?
And that's something that I do in this book. I talk about these different paradigms, but you could also think of them as historical eras. The Enlightenment is the first time. It's the first time that we hear anybody talking about race in this continental division kind of sense of difference. That's because before that time, there weren't people traveling that far and seeing people on different continents. But once we had those travelers coming back and reporting what they saw, a lot of it was just like stories of monsters on other continents and, a lot of lies, right? But we had people in Europe who were the scholars, like the preeminent scholars of their time, who would teach courses. Immanuel Kant, kind of a famous philosopher we associate with the Age of Reason, Enlightenment era, enlightenment, that word in general. He taught this course that was like an anthropology course. It was like the first kind of anthropology course. So he talked about how in different continents, people were different, totally discreetly different. And he had actually never left his hometown. So he actually didn't know anything. He just was listening to other people tell tales, sailors, medics on ships or whatever, people who had like been to other places. And maybe they'd only been to one other place, but they nevertheless made it seem like if you go to different continents, you will find totally different human forms on those other continents. And so he just perpetuated this idea and made it actual scholarship, right? Made it like the word of reason that humans were different based on the continent of origin. So a lot of the way that I like to talk about the lie of race, the fiction that was created, is to call it continental race, because that's the framework we got from that. And that just never changed. So what happened is after we had Charles Darwin, who actually came to different places, he actually did sail himself to different parts of the world and saw people in different continents, islands, what have you. He gave us this idea that we were all one big human family and we were all evolved from a common ancestor. But he also ascribed to this idea that thing that Kant and other people were calling races were pretty much was true. We could use that terminology if we wanted to, because there were these continental varieties of human. So Darwin reinforced this idea that had already existed before there was anybody collecting data, so to speak. He reinforced this idea that yes, there was continental race. It was true. Whether or not we are all from different sources, or whether we're all one big family, there was something to it, this idea of continental race. His cousin, Francis Galton, was kind of like our real first genetics dude, right? He opened up a lab in Hyde Park in London, and he basically started like measuring people's intelligence, and he was doing all of this kind of building out of the field of modern genetics. And he created a lot of, the tools that we use today, a lot of the metrics, right? Or inspired them, things like IQ. And he really dug into this idea of continental differences. So he was just like, there are different races. They are totally discrete. And even though we might be of the same human family, we should breed out or exterminate the people who come from the lower races. Unfortunately, Darwin also ascribed to this idea that there were higher and lower races. So check out the history chapter in my book for some of the quotes and juicy details of that. But so I talk about how after the Enlightenment era, we moved into the modern era, or the modern paradigm of race. And that was this heavily genetic idea that it was just the genes showed that we had different continental races, and genes and race were the same thing. And, it was like intelligence, all behavior, it was all just like, it was a figment of our genes. Of course, we know from history that after the Nazi atrocities were exposed in the late 1940s through the early 1950s, we know that most scientists around the world, and especially, people who had been proponents of eugenics before the war, because there were so many proponents of eugenics all over the world, and like the leading genetics labs around the world were eugenics labs, right? Because that's just what Galton had created. These scientists turned away from eugenics and that modern sense of race. And the UN, in fact, came into play with a really big conference convening all of these experts and saying, we got to write a new truth of race. We have to say, like, race is not what you think it is, and let the public know. So I talk about how that was a time where we had this UNESCO version of race, or it was the UNESCO kind of era of like righting the wrongs of genetics of the modern era. But the problem with the UNESCO version was that because they really focused on what was real and what was not real from a genetic standpoint, those scholars who created the UNESCO statements on race that became kind of like the truth for the next couple of decades until the genomic science kind of arrived on the scene. So those scientists kind of left intact this idea that they said, well, races are not behaviorally different. They're not more or less intelligent than one another, but they exist. So their version was just that race is just a kind of going back to like early Darwin kind of ideas of like, sure, there are different varieties. There are continental races, but we're just saying that we can't rank them. There's no hierarchy amongst them. And so that was a problem because that left intact this idea of continental race, that lie that we started with in the first place, that was created before anybody even went anywhere and knew any. So when genomics, the genome kind of, they call it the recombinant revolution. It's like when scholars started to be able to look at not just single genes running through families and looking at, DNA pedigrees of specific diseases and things like that. When scientists started to be able to look at chunks of our genome and look at sequences of DNA like that were inherited and passed on together, that's when we got what I call genomic race or genomic era. And the paradigm that came from that has been a greater focus on the relationship between the social and the biological, which is awesome and great. But in many cases, we still haven't gotten rid of this continental differences thing. And so I know that the scientists that I, worked with and interviewed for my first book way back when, my first book, Race Decoded, was published in 2012. So I was like working with these scientists, as the Human Genome Project was really coming to a close and other projects, spin-off projects were coming to a close and all of that stuff, and new ones were being launched. Basically, we never really dealt with this idea of continental race. We've never gotten it down to the message to say like what race really is. And that's why I had to write this book. Coming full circle to the last question, in a sense, it's like the history shows that we never really fixed our race problem. The lies are still governing how we think about human difference.
It's cool to hear you talk about it in this way because I've done the family tree DNA tests, the ancestry. I'm always just really curious about, just in general, how I exist, where my ancestors came from, and, even way back. So I've done the autosomal tests, and then I've done the mtDNA. I got my dad, the Y-DNA. So, I find it really fascinating, whether it's a close relation or thousands of years ago. And what's weird is that looking at results, especially if you look at Y-DNA and maternal, you're just like, these people come from everywhere. There is you can kind of see that this doesn't make any sense in terms of race. They're from everywhere. But if you look at if you're just doing an autosomal and you just want to see Nigeria or England or China, then okay, then I can see if that's what you're looking for, then that's what you're going to accept, and that kind of reinforces it in your mind.
Ancestry tests are, what you're pointing out is that they're limited in what they can tell you based on what they're mapping, right? What they're analyzing, which part of your DNA they're analyzing. Also, different companies analyze different amounts of markers. So that's kind of interesting. So aside from even doing whole genome analysis, most people don't do that. It's not a commercially available or even viable thing because it's so expensive still, and so there are wealthy people who have done that, but it's kind of, and also there are volunteers who have done, the Personal Genomes Project and different things like that. So you can get a whole genome analysis if you want to, but yeah, it's cost prohibitive. And so people usually take the different tests from the companies like Family Tree DNA or whatever companies that have been out there. The thing about those companies, besides whether looking into all of the different parts of your DNA that are of interest to you, you wouldn't know what those options would be, and they aren't going to tell you, what the limitations of theirs are, aside from maybe a disclaimer that this only tells you a little bit about something, blah, blah, blah. But that's more like a legal disclaimer, And then part that most people never hear about is that the reference genomes that different companies use are very different from one another. And there's no company that has access to all of the different DNA options or, heritage or lineages or what you want to call it, all the different kind of groups or whatever however you want to call it out there in the world. My mom was just asking me not too long ago whether she should take some DNA testing in order to learn more about her mom's lineage. And her mom was adopted. And so, she was like, I really want to know. I know that she was adopted in Banjarmasin, in Kalimantan, but I don't know, and I had to break it to her that I don't think that there are any DNA companies that have a lot of DNA from Kalimantan or from specific, parts of the different islands, over 17,000 islands of Indonesia. That's a problem because when she gets the results, she's going to think whatever they told her, that's where her mom's from. And that's not probably going to be true. And especially people who were enslaved or people who were brought over as forced labor or people whose ancestors were adopted or abandoned, or if there was femicide or some kind of getting rid of the girls and abandoning kids to the woods or any, there are so many ways that people lose a sense of their heritage. And that's even not even acknowledging that most people, because now today we also live in a situation where there's a 1% and then a 99%. But back in the day, it was very polarized. People who had history and family history were aristocrats, or whatever the parallel, social order was in Banjarmasin or whatever, Banjarmasin didn't exist as Banjarmasin, but, basically in that area, right? So it's there were people who had a history and got to like know this is where our family has been and this is where they come from and this is why our name is this. And then there are everybody else who did not know that. And those people were moving around. And so it becomes to the point where you can't even know where you really came from. You can just know where the people in the world are that company has sequenced DNA from, or that they have access to DNA, and that those people today, right now, are living, but we don't know where they actually came from themselves. So I feel like that's the part about it. It's like, if you know that you just want to kind of get a sense of, in general, where you share ancestry with people, that's totally fine, But my mom, the problem with her case of it is that she already knows where her mom came from. So she knows like the island, at least, where her mom, was adopted. So it's kind of like different than if you're in the US and you were brought here as forced labor or as an enslaved person, and then you don't know at all like your ancestors come from. I could see wanting to know at least at all like where somebody could have possibly passed through.
That's why I did it. My dad's family is really big on it too. A lot of us have done it. And the thing that I tell people, because some people, they get their results and they're like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. That's number one. Or as science changes, your results get updated over time and they hold on to what the previous results were. And like, you have to understand, this is literally just giving you basic information. You have to either do your own research and really look it up, or just take it with a grain of salt. This is a general area. It's not that specific that you literally are from that place. I mean, I'm a history buff, but I find it really interesting to do research and find all that information out to try and get more specific about where people may have actually came from. Unfortunately, for me, trying to do specific things, it always leads back to Europe, because that's the only real traceable lines you can find, which that's just the way that history, race, and culture and ethnicity have been kind of set up. Like, there's no records for African slaves, but there's going to be records for Europeans.
That's why I say that race is a social reality. It was made through colonization, through settler colonialism, through enslavement, and all of that, forced labor, all of that history. That's what created the divisions that we experience. So there's the divisions that we see and the divisions we experience. And actually, I would like to talk about the divisions we see, because that was really like the impetus for me writing a book on what's real about race. And I think people still will have that lingering thought, especially your listeners will be wondering, but what about the things we see, right? One of the things that I want people to realize is that we have been conditioned to see differences in a certain way, to value them, put value on them. And so, sure, we all look different from one another. I look different from my mom. My mom looks different from her mom, and her mom looks different from that person that we don't know who is her mom. So we all look different from each other. We're all different from each other. You and I are different, and you and Chandi are different, and Chandi, you and Zoe are different, and we're all different. But the thing that we do when we say, well, we're continentally different, that part is training based on the lie that I talked about before. That, if you look at the classification systems, like the first human taxonomies that were published as authoritative books, those, and also the material that Kant taught in his anthropology class, all of that material just said, this continent, Americas, their skin is red, their hair is straight. And then it would say like, this is what they behave like. This is how they are. And then same with like Asia, their skin is yellow, their hair is black, their eyes are beady or something like that. They're sneaky, don't trust them, like that kind of thing. African, their hair is woolly, it's black, their skin is dark brown, they are unintelligent, must be enslaved, so it's like everything. And then of course, white, European, beautiful, pink, white skin, whatever they would say, like glorious, wears robes, born to rule, right? And so it's just like every single continent had its own, this is what you look like, this is how you are, this is how you behave, this is how smart you are, this is what we should do with these people. And so because we were told that lie for all these centuries, we see like, oh, that hair, it looks like that texture. those eyes, they look like that shape. The eyelids are this way versus this other way. So we put value on it too. So we're like, sometimes we say something beautiful, like that almond shaped eye is so nice or something, like whatever, most of the time it's negative with respect to the European classification, right? So like the darker skin, if it's very dark, that's a bad thing, right? And if the nose shape is a certain straightness versus like wideness or whatever, like it's all of these things that were written back in the day when people accepted that continental race was a real thing. We have to unlearn that and unteach that, right? So we have to be able to say, like, we all look different, but we don't need to be like, oh, that shape of eye is associated with this much intelligence or sneakiness or whatever, right? We don't need to be saying like this shape of lip is associated with must be enslaved or can't be trusted or, whatever the thing, right? And so we'll have to learn how to be like, okay, that's just this person, this is the hair, this is the cheekbones, this is the whatever, that stuff. We don't need to keep dredging up this, like, this is the value system and whether you can trust people or not based on how they look. But at the same time, we'll have to do so acknowledging that people who are racialized or race to be called white or called Black or called Asian and whatnot, that they are treated differently by people who have not unlearned these things, and that those people therefore will have common social experiences and common political experiences and common interests in fighting discrimination, interest in fighting racism. And they will also have similar, in some cases, they will have similar economic standing, similar labor flows and things like that, because we are still discriminating according to the old lies. If I can just kind of leave your listeners with something on the what we see part of it, I just want them to understand that we don't have to see in that continental race schematic. We can stop seeing in that continental race schematic and keep that schematic around for acknowledging racism, acknowledging bias. So it's kind of like a tricky thing because you have to, like, for yourself, understand that even if I am using these categories still to call out racism, which I want us to do, and if I am a scientist who's using them to document and map out how racism affects our bodies and our health, as I want scientists to do, and as I do, I still want people to be able to have the conversation with themselves and with their kids saying, like, but there is no actual value to these continental divisions.
Why do you feel like it's so important to tackle the intersection of science, genetics, and society right now?
We definitely put a lot of stock in what DNA science says. When I say we, I mean people living in the USA. I think that dispelling the myths that are still circulating despite all of this great genomic research that we're getting is a priority for me. I think that in some ways, the more technology, the further the technology goes, I guess I want to say, like, especially with things like CRISPR gene editing, the more it seems like DNA is the solution and is like the cause of everything that's going on in our lives. And so if you can, kind of cut out a disease gene and splice in something that is healthy, a healthy gene, I think that if we get to the point where we're doing things like that, I think that people will just really believe that DNA is the source of everything. And especially because even as I was just mentioning how from my last book, which was Rethinking Intelligence, published in 2023 to now, 2025, early 2025, how there have been new technologies and new markets in some of the technologies that have been kind of developing over the last couple of years. So even since the publication of this book, I have heard about clinical options for people to basically select for embryos that have different kind of intelligence profiles, or, in a sense, they're saying, like, we can select your baby's IQ. And so that's like moved into the clinic. And I think that with all of these technologies that are emerging and seem to be giving us a definitive way to control our offspring and control our genomes. I think that everyday people are going to really buy into this notion that you can control everything. And so I want to say, let's put the brakes on that while we can before it gets out of control. Because if you go into a clinic and then somebody says like, oh, would you like us to select for embryo that has higher IQ. And then they tell you like, oh, this one's going to not have ADHD, or this one's going to have, whatever we're going to give you one that has certain kind of blue eyes, or we're going to get you one that has, and you just like look at all of these criteria, that people will just believe that this is all in our DNA. And I want to head it off at the pass and say, race is not a biological construct. It's a social construct. But even better, let's just call it reality. It's a social reality.
You've done a lot of research about how race has been classified, described throughout history, modern day, all different eras. What is the strangest and weirdest misconception that you kind of came across and thought, people actually thought like this?
I've seen a lot of strange things from the early community of people who were trying to build out that genomics of social behavior, what my collaborator Gene Robinson calls sociogenomics. And I've seen a lot that has not always been linked to anything to do with race. But early on, there were some people who are a little bit messy with how they were communicating results. And there was also in the media, like misrepresentations of early forms of that research. So the kind of thing where there was a researcher, I think down in Florida, who was looking at genes associated with violent behavior and gang participation, gang membership. And I thought that was irresponsible and also very risky for reinforcing racist ideas about people who we think look like they'd be in a gang. And so now I guess I was not so surprised when the media printed the news of the research. They did so with pictures of what looked like, to me, like Latinx gang members. And so it wasn't a direct connection between people who are of a specific race and the DNA research, but it was a kind of sloppy way of it becoming connected in the media. And it was, to me, shocking and dismaying. I was very disappointed that that was coming out of our kind of newest, most exciting area of DNA research, sociogenomics. That was a long time ago. And I know that, the people who do research in this field do not publish anything that can be misconstrued. They're very careful about, racial connotations in their research. But, nevertheless, even in taking as much care as they have wanted to, there have been problems. And one of them I write about in What's Real About Race, which is in 2022, there was a person who downloaded some of this research, and it was around educational attainment, which is basically how far you get in school. And this individual, Peyton Gendron, misread what the conclusions of that research were and basically posted this manifesto to Google and to Discord. And it said that Blacks were genetically unintelligent. And then he went and killed a bunch of people in a Tops-friendly supermarket in Buffalo, New York. So he posted this online, and it had the actual research that this community was like really heavily involved in, and is still heavily involved in. And they were also devastated by this happening, of course. And so, we've worked together and continue to work to really clean up the way that we message about human variation. But it's an ongoing process. So those are two things that I think of when I think of like surprising and dismaying. But I also am really concerned about the clinical kind of uses of this research, because right now, if clinics are saying, we'll help you have hyper intelligent or more intelligent babies, and we're going to design them, it's like, I still think that there's a lot of harm in making those claims, given that intelligence is still so heavily racialized in our culture. And that's something I wrote about a lot in Rethinking Intelligence was how standardized tests, IQ tests, also other forms of intelligence tests, and even just like SATs, heavily privileged white affluent test takers. It's actually something that I think now there's a lot of knowledge about this. It's not like news anymore, but that they also heavily penalize test takers of color and test takers who are underserved from underserved communities. And so basically, like, it's a dangerous place for us to be. And we are there. This is where we are right now.
Yeah, the standardized test thing, I've realized that for years when I was a kid. I went to a high school, I guess it was the majority of the students were white. And then there were maybe like 4 Black kids, 2 Asian kids. We were even doing the PSAT, just discussing it afterwards. I was happy just for that moment because like one of the topics for one of the sections was something that I knew a lot about. I think it was like parapsychology. And then like the others, they're like, I don't even know what that is. It can happen where like you don't even know what it's talking about. And so you try to answer the questions and it's not making sense to you. Your answers are not going to align with what the questions are. And then there was somebody who, it was more of a cultural thing. And obviously he was not from here, so he's not going to get the reference. So those things happen, and it's not that the person isn't intelligent, it's that the topics that they might be choosing for these tests, certain communities, certain populations don't like explicitly know all that much about that. Not that every population would either, but some more so than others, because maybe it's just culturally being, I guess, like represented, that whatever that topic is represented in that culture more so than others. That can definitely happen. I guess you talked about, media representation. And obviously sometimes we see on the news the photos that they might show or the photos that they don't show when it comes to like criminal suspects and things like that. The little bits of information that they mention, right? If it's somebody who's Hispanic or Black, they'll actually say it. As if it's just a white person, they may not even say anything. They'll just say that guy. But how has the misuse or misrepresentation of genetic science contributed to systemic racism, more so in media, I guess, because we talked about history, but, just kind of what we see, because those things, whether it's news or movies or TV, you see what you see.
The media has been particularly good at representing emerging studies and really wow factor kind of findings from genomic science, and they have not been good at all, if not they've been bad, at representing what studies actually have found. And sometimes that is because the studies themselves, the research reports misrepresent in a way what the studies actually were about. And I can explain what I mean by that in just a moment. But and sometimes it's just sensationalism. Media just wanting to say whites, blacks, or say, Asians this, and we do see a lot of interviews of white nationalists, and we see a lot of messages from white supremacists out there in the media too. So that, it's like there's a lot of representation of that perspective, even if it is to critique it. It's like it's out there, this like people dropping the idea that in this country the focus is on anti-Black kind of racism, right? In Europe and other parts of the world, there's a big focus on it's Islamophobia, really. It's like the messages that you see in the media, even when they're to be critiqued, they are out there. And you hear this cacophony of racism in the media. So the thing I was going to say about the research reports is that one of the things that I and many others have documented over time is how the field of genomics, where they publish their best articles, those journals have policies around representation of different groups. And sometimes those journals tell researchers to use terms like white and Black. And sometimes they tell researchers to specify European American versus African American. So when a colleague of mine, Aaron Panofsky, who is the director of the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA, when we did an analysis of one of these journals at 3 different moments in time over a 10-year period, we found that there was an increasing push for scientists to publish something that looked like continental race to publish population differences and all of that kind of stuff. And we also saw that when we looked at actual articles and we looked at like the methods, like what people were being sampled, what DNA was actually being studied, we would find that like something that was represented later in the final report as being European would be like DNA from people in like Finland or something like that, So it would be like people would be sometimes through the journal policy encouraged to zoom way out to the continental level from something that was so specific. And I'm not even saying Finland in general. It's like, it would be like DNA sampled from an island in Finland, So it would be like so specific. And that kind of sloppiness, makes its way into the major news media. And so, it's like part of it is the media's sensationalist kind of approach to just want to say like, we're just totally different genetically speaking. These continental races are totally different. But some of it also is on the shoulders of the journals, and some of it is also researchers themselves, like not really realizing when they're doing it, when they're changing that level and zooming out. And so there are a lot of places where we can kind of fine tune our representation, and I hope that we'll do that.
Like, it seems like a lot of this leads back to eugenics and like what is like the perfect preferred ideal person.
Definitely. And we really are creating a new form of eugenics with these research applications. I know that when I was working with all of these sociogenomic scientists that were focused on human differences, that the people I spoke with did not want to see their research applied in the clinic or with DNA tests and whatnot. Nevertheless, there have been so many applications of that research. And that's a problem for scientists who are like, I'm warning you, don't do this, don't misuse my research. But it's like, you can't even warn enough, because the way a scientist or a team of scientists, even a ginormous team of scientists, a genome project or whatnot, the way that they communicate risks and their own version of like a desist kind of like do not do this is through some kind of ethical paper or suite of ethical papers that say like, or like a supplemental module that says these are the limitations, this is what you cannot say, this is what would be completely inaccurate, this is how you'd be turning this paper into a very dangerous lie or myth, or a technology that we don't believe in. So that's like, it always moves through the scientific channel, and it remains in a sense within the community. Even if you publish something and you go on the news and you say like, watch out, don't do this, it's up to whatever company to decide whether they want to take the research there or not. And of course, that's what happened with that mass shooter. He wasn't convinced by whatever the disclaimers were on that educational attainment paper. He was not reading that and thinking like, okay, I better not do this. It's like, he just thought like, this satisfies what I believe. And actually, that's something I write about in terms of ancestry tests, is that white supremacists and white nationalists, they use the tests too to try to confirm their biases. And, if they can't confirm them, then they get really mad at the test makers. And, the tests are made by like, sneaky Jews or whatever, right? So people will take the research and do what they want with it. So we have to be more careful upstream not to create this research that is cordoned off by continental variation. And that happens sometimes because researchers just have a bunch of samples from somewhere like Finland, and then they just publish it as being European. Even doing something where you just research on one small group, as you were saying, it's like it can still be misinterpreted as race.
I mean, people read and hear what they want to hear. They see what they want to see. So if that's what they want confirmed, if they see it and they read it, then in their mind it's confirmed. I want to say even in Appalachia, there's like a group of people, they did their DNA tests and they could have sworn up and down that they're part Portuguese and whatnot. When the test came back and said that they're like at least a quarter Black, they're like freaked out. That test is wrong. Like some people just really like if it's not confirming what they have believed or what they've been told, then it's got to be wrong. And it's very rare that DNA tests would be wrong.
Let's talk about you, Rina. Has your personal background influenced your perspective on race, genetics, and society?
Oh, definitely. I really was confused by race. I was really perplexed by race as far back as I can remember. I mean, I really remember being in preschool and thinking about this aspect of what I looked like, that aspect of my mom's heritage, or what, the clothes that she put me in, her accent, and I noticed also how my friends and their parents would regard my mom, how they would regard my dad, who's from the US and has Eastern and Northwestern European ancestry. I always had this kind of like, whoa, they are treated very differently. And they look differently. And one of them, according to the media, is supposed to be this way, and the other one's supposed to be this other way. And then for myself, when I was really little, I looked more like my Indonesian grandparents or like in particular my grandpa than even my mom, and so I had a certain like dark skin, and yeah, I was mixed, so being mixed, like I felt this alienation from other kids. I grew up in Los Angeles and in a very, very diverse neighborhood and school system. In fact, my schools, they were engineered to be diverse, class-wise and culturally and ethnically and, racially as well. And so I had friends from all over the world, but the stereotypes about different races were so strong in the media and in my community and in the schools that I think we really saw ourselves in terms of those stereotypes. So it's like you can have a diverse place and people can be from different places and still devalue themselves. There's internalized racism that we experience. I also experienced racism coming from other people, bullies who were just basically wanted to torture me for being different. And maybe I was a threat because I was mixed, or maybe it was, just being dark-skinned at the time, or darker skin than white kids. But there were white bullies in my classes. Even when I was in kindergarten, there was white bullies being mean to the dark-skinned kids, and including me. So it was always personal for me from the beginning. And now I am a parent, and so I get to see how kids are being taught here today in another diverse place. I live in New Jersey now, so it's like very, very diverse here. And mostly I see better, way better, but it's not perfect. And part of what you were talking before about standardized tests and the way that those are biased, they're culturally biased, and in many ways they're racially biased as well, and they're definitely class biased. I think that those subtle ways that structural racism kind of reproduces itself, that hasn't really changed yet. I think that for the kids today, I think there are a lot of mixed kids in the schools where my kids go to, and there are a lot of positive stereotypes, positive claims being made about people of color. And there are, parent groups for parents of students of color and things like that. So it's like, and also I'm very lucky in the school where we teach, where my kids go to school. Principal is a man of color, and so it's just like, it just is way better than what I experienced growing up. But we still have such a long way to go.
Well, speaking of having such a long way to go, what advice would you give to anyone who wants to better understand the relationship between race and genetics but doesn't know where to start?
Well, definitely start with my book, hopefully. And I wrote it so that pretty much anybody could read it. I've even seen my kids pick it up and read passages from it. So they are very early readers, and they can understand some of it. And so I think that also we have a 95-year-old grandmother in our family, and actually great grandmother. And so she also has read the book. And so it's like, basically it speaks to people from all backgrounds and all ages. And I think that it'll be a good place to start. And then also just go from there and start taking stock of or noticing the ways that race and racial thinking come into your own life. And I think that people would be really surprised if they started to be kind of like seeing with a little bit of a critical distance their own thought processes, because I think that we're so busy, we don't even realize that we're thinking through racial lenses, or through a racial lens a lot of the time. And I think it's good when we are seeing through a racial lens, when we're using it to kind of dismantle that lens. So it's like noticing a person of color being treated a specific way that is, less than the way that their white counterpart would be treated. That's a good use of that racial lens, but it's like when you're doing it just knee jerk and you're just like thinking like, oh, that person's means like I saw that person coming down the street, then they must be this type of person, and not thinking critically about that, then we're reinforcing the lie that we started with all those centuries ago. It really isn't going to change until we do that work for ourselves and we teach our kids how to do that work and teach all the younger generation. I have hope for our elders. I know that there are a lot of people who I want there to be equality in this world, meaningful equality, but I especially think that we have to focus on teaching a different way for our youth, because youth are going to eventually go out there and shape the institutions that we all share. And if we can get some critical thinkers out there, that will do, so much better for us. Then we won't get to that kind of messy place where people are publishing research that sounds racist and that the media then publishes as some kind of racist doctrine, right? And then people who are mentally ill out there are, can use to like go and kill a bunch of people. It's like we have to get away from that cycle of misrepresentation and get into a place where we are teaching and learning and unlearning and relearning a better way of constructing our social reality of race.
And on that note, if you could change one, common belief about race overnight, what would it be?
That it's in our DNA. I would change that race is in our DNA, that belief that somewhere you can just pick out the gene variant or the series of variants that prove that I'm Asian versus Native or Indigenous American versus Pacific Islander versus Black versus white. And I really do think one of the things I didn't answer that was asked earlier was, what's the difference between race and ethnicity and cultural differences and things like that. And I do think that if I could have another thing to eradicate or, dispel, is that we are different at the continental level, because ethnicity, sometimes it overlaps with race, but most of the time when we think of ethnicity, we're thinking about something that's subcontinental and even subnational, right? So it's like ethnicity can be people on the island that my mom is from, there's like Dayak culture, so it's like Dayak is like considered like the ethnicity. I guess Asian would be their race. It's really hard because they're indigenous. So it's very hard for me to think of that. That's why race is that continental level is so problematic, because it's like as if the indigenous people from my mom's island are the same, exact thing as people from Tokyo, Japan or whatever, or from Jakarta, Indonesia, it's like, that's just such a misconception that like we're all one type of person, right? And so I would also want to dispel that myth, that continental differences matter, especially when we look at medical issues. There's nothing that tracks onto a continent that is like all the people from that continent have that disease or that health trait, right? Like there's nothing that maps onto continents. So the continental divide thing is really, really damaging. And I would love to see that go out the window too.
Yeah, I think the medical thing is a big one that I've always thought of, because if you're so focused on being one particular thing, but you have, other, I don't know, cultural, ethnic groups that, like, you have to still pay attention to the fact that there's medical, diseases, disorders, diagnoses that can come from those other places. Like, it really doesn't matter. You can get anything. There's no real specifics, right? What is it? Let's say like sickle cell, where it's like people are saying, oh, it comes from a very specific place. Warmer climates in general, yeah. So then you have to look at the wider like swath of places where that could be a problem. Like, it's not just this specific group of people.
Exactly, because then, if we just treat the people that we mistakenly believe are, going to have that disease, then maybe those people, because we're in America, and the people who are descendants of formerly enslaved people are more likely to have a genotype that is associated with sickle cell disease. Maybe that seems true for where we are, but that means that we wouldn't even look for it in people all around the world who are from other places. And, there's prevalence in many other parts of the world, in many other groups of people that we are, would be shocked to find, it's like that don't hail from the continent of Africa or from, Western or Central Africa or wherever, we assume that to be because of where we live, right? So yeah, the medical thing is really, really fascinating and also, that has to do with the culture as well, because and ethnicity and cultural practices, because there are so many practices that are preventative that it's like we think like, oh, if you have this genotype or this allele or this gene variant, then it means that you're going to get this disease. And that's just not true,
What do you hope people really take away from your book?
I hope that people take away that we need to prioritize doing this work of unlearning racial and continental differences as being truth, as being, embedded in our DNA. And I want people to spread the word and, like I was saying, teach the youngins, teach the kids so that they can face the lies with truth and with what science really tells us, which is that race is a social reality, not a biological fact.
I mean, thank you for writing this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Rina.
doing this. We really enjoy the conversation. It's great for a lot of people to hear about this. We'd like to thank Rina for joining us today to unpack one of the most persistent myths in science, that race is biological. As we've learned, race may not be written in our DNA, but its social consequences are very real.
So go pick up our book, What's Really Real About Race. You can find it at your local bookstore or online through Amazon, and we'll include a direct link in the episode's show notes. To learn more about Rina, her work, and her other books, visit her website at drrinabliss.com. That's drrinabliss.com.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. As always, you can find us on social media, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until then.